Well, good morning. Welcome to Creeks End today. Good to see you. And I have to just celebrate today. Happy anniversary, Church at Creeks End. 15 years today. Today. So if you're watching online, welcome to the celebration. We're not just celebrating today, and we don't have cake. I don't want to disappoint you. Okay, there's no cake waiting for us. But we are celebrating this entire month the fact that God put us here 15 years ago today, and he did it so that we could be significant in our community and in our area, and he did it so that you could be significant in playing a part of that. And we're calling this series Created for Significance, because everyone wants to have significance. We know that. We all long for our lives to mean something. And for many people who want to connect with God, sometimes there's something keeping them from doing that. They don't know how. And so 15 years ago, we decided to try to add a rung to the ladder, so to speak, of what that means to be significant and how God created us to be significant. So last week, what we learned was, that significance that we long for can only be had when we align our purpose with God's purpose. And we learned that God's purpose is not about rules. It's more about loving people, and in particular, about getting people to the party, about getting people to heaven. And if that's not our purpose, we need to align our purpose with God's purpose so that we're on the same path that he is and doing what he wants us to do. Now, last week I began to share with you the journey of how God brought me to that place. And, I told you I went on that personal retreat, got me a little room at this retreat place off of Lake Conroe, and I was reading through Luke, and we read through Luke chapter 14, and it was that chapter that God began to deal with me about doing something new. I wasn't sure what that was, but that's what he began to move me toward. And then the next couple of chapters I began to read after I got home. And we're going to be in Luke 15 today, if you want to turn there with me. And we're going to take a look and continue the journey that God took me on and that I would like to take you on as well. I want to begin with a question this morning. And that question is this: what's important to God? What really matters to God? And this is the kind of idea I want to kind of rally around today. We were created for significance. And that significance we long for comes only when what matters to God matters to us. If we're going to align our purpose with God's purpose, then we need to ask God, well, what's important to you, God? What matters to you, God? What do you really care about? What's really important to you? And if you study your Bible, you'll discover that from cover to cover, God's on this all-out search for two kinds of people. And he's not just a casual shopper like walking through the mall kind of shopping. He's intense in his search for two categories of people. And my hope is that in the next few minutes, you're going to be able to diagnose the category that you belong in, or the category you want to belong in, because we're all in each of these two categories. So let's get at it. I told you last week, January of 2003, I read Luke 14. God spoke so strong to me that I prayed this very bold prayer: Lord, change me. And I invited you to pray that prayer with me last week. So after that, I got to Luke 15. As I got home, I kept reading the Gospel of Luke. And Luke 15 is the record of Jesus telling three stories or parables: the stories of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost or wayward son. And if you read Jesus' parables, you discover that normally when he tells a parable, he usually follows it up by telling us the meaning of the parable. But in this particular instance, in Luke 15, Jesus doesn't pause to explain. He just launches into the next parable and then the next. And these stories are so rich and carefully woven that I don't have time to unpack them all today. We'll talk about the first two a little bit in detail, and then the third one I'm going to talk about in detail next week, so you'll want to come back for that. But I want to show you what God showed me through this. Luke chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. Now, let's stop there for just a second and get some context. Remember last week in Luke 14, Jesus had been invited over to the home of a prominent Pharisee after church for dinner. And when he got there, you remember the debacle of this man that they had waiting outside who had edema, who was dying. And they were daring Jesus to heal him on the Sabbath. They were trying to trap Jesus. Well, as we saw last week, Jesus did heal the guy. Now, I'm kind of reading between the lines here, but I would just imagine that once that guy was healed, he went and told everybody he knew about what just happened to him. I mean, wouldn't you? And that's probably what he did, because now Jesus has drawn a crowd. And I don't know if they're inside the house and everybody else is outside around the windows and the doors, because they would not have been invited in to a prominent Pharisee's home because they were tax collectors and sinners. So either they were all kind of huddled around the outside of the house, or maybe they moved the party outside. I don't know. But now there's a crowd, and it's a crowd including the Pharisees, who it started with, and then all of these tax collectors and sinners. Verse 2 says, "But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.' And that's when Jesus told them this parable. Verse 4, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my sheep.'" Now, what did he just do? He just had a party. He invited all his friends and neighbors. And when you do that, that's a party, right? Waiting to happen. Open up the Tostitos and the salsa and let's get with it. I found my sheep. And here's what Jesus says in verse 7. "I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent." Now notice that Jesus starts this story with, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep." Now literally, this should be translated, "Which of you being a shepherd?" Now remember, he's delivering this story to a group of devoutly religious leaders, very upper class Orthodox Jews. And in their minds, in their day, a shepherd was a very low trade. A shepherd was a second-class citizen. It's interesting when you keep in mind that when Jesus was born, who did he tell first? Second-class citizens. The shepherds, right? There's a lot of significance in that. But Jesus knows that these men think of shepherds as second-class citizens, so he chooses to tell about a shepherd to get their attention. And he makes up this story about a shepherd, and he asks them a question about doing something that they would never do. He says, "Which of you being a shepherd?" Now, immediately, all of them know the answer. I would not be a shepherd. If I had sheep, I would hire a shepherd, but I'm not going to be a lowly second-class shepherd. Jesus knows that. So Jesus gets their attention and says quickly, "Suppose you were a shepherd." And while they're all thinking about what despicable trade sheep herding is, he tells them about a shepherd who loves his sheep. And the second shock comes to them when this shepherd is saddled with the responsibility of actually losing a sheep. In verse 4, he says, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them." In Middle Eastern cultures, just like in a Spanish culture, saving face is important. If you were describing a sheep that had strayed, you would never say, "Suppose the shepherd loses one of them." To save face, you would say, "Suppose one of them wandered off." Now, it's like in Spanish. How many of you speak Spanish? Some of you do. In Spanish, if I'm eating dinner and I accidentally bump my plate so that it falls on the floor and breaks, what do I say? I say, "Se rompió." It broke itself. A Spanish-speaking person would never say, I broke the plate, because that would be indicating that they're clumsy and not being able to save face. Instead, they would say, it broke itself. Now, in English, we would say, I broke the plate, right? But not so. And it's the same in most Middle Eastern languages. You wouldn't say, I lost the sheep. You would say, the sheep got lost. But Jesus says, the shepherd loses one of them. So this is a shepherd no Pharisee would want to imitate. But this shepherd loves his sheep. Now, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. In Jesus' story, how many sheep did the shepherd have? 100, yes. And what happens to them? One wanders off, right? One is lost. He leaves the other 99 in the open country. He doesn't even bring them back to the city and corral them. He leaves them unprotected in the open country, in potential danger, just to go find that one that's lost. Now, when he does find the sheep, what does he do? He parties. He rejoices. He celebrates. He says to his friends, rejoice with me. Why? Because he's happy. He found the lost sheep. So he throws a party. Well, Jesus goes on in verse 8. He says, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, look at this, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, break out the dip and chips, let's have a party. Rejoice, she says, with me. I have found my lost coin. And in the same way, Jesus says, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, who's the star of the second parable? A woman. The first one, we have a shepherd. The second one, we have a woman. Who's Jesus talking to as he tells the parable? Men, Pharisaic men. Now, how did a Pharisaic man feel about women? They were third-class citizens. Shepherds, second class. Women, third class. That's the culture they lived in. And what does the woman have that's of value to her? 10 coins. 10 coins. Now, I want you to notice something. 100 sheep, 10 coins. Jesus is starting to reduce the proportions. Now, coins were very rare in agrarian cultures. Most of the bargaining was done by bartering. If you couldn't barter, you would only use money in case of an emergency, but most everything else was bartered. You would trade for what you needed. Most scholars think that this woman's coins, and this is very much like their culture, that these coins represented her dowry, her bride price. And usually back then, history tells us that women would take those coins and they would probably make jewelry out of them. She would take those 10 coins and make a necklace out of those 10 coins. And so when this woman lost her coin, it ruined her whole ensemble. It wasn't just that she was down one coin. She was also wearing jewelry that had part of the decorations missing. Now, maybe guys, you can relate to this, and I know you women can relate to this. From time to time, I've been at home at night. We're getting in from somewhere, and we're getting ready for bed, and I'm in the bedroom about to, get in the bed, and all of a sudden, I hear this, and all the oxygen is sucked out of the room. And I run into the bathroom and say, honey, what's wrong? And she's looking in the mirror, and she's going, I have an earring missing. And it's like, major, stop everything. And we're on our hands and knees trying to find that one little earring. Why? Because it messed up her whole ensemble, right? So now you kind of understand what this woman's feeling. She's lost part of that ensemble, part of that dowry, part of that bride-to-be price, and she's panicking, and she scours the house until she finds it. And when she finds it, what does she do? She throws a party. All the friends and neighbors. Why? Because she's happy. She's happy she found it. Let's go on, verse 11. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off to a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son. Now let me stop here, and I want you to circle that phrase, he ran to his son. We're going to talk to that about that in just a minute. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and what? Party. Celebrate. Why? For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Jesus tells his third story, and it's the story of the father who had 2 sons. Now we're going to dig deeper into this one next week, but I want you to notice the progression. 100 sheep, 10 coins, 2 sons. He's lowering the proportions. One of the 2 sons gets lost, but eventually turns up again. And when he does, it says, as I told you to circle, his father runs to him. Now, what's interesting about that is what that father did is something that no Middle Eastern landowner would ever do, run. Because to run would mean that he would have to lift up his robe, and to lift up his robe meant that he exposed his ankles, and that was a no-no in Middle Eastern culture for men. And to do so, he would basically lose face in front of the whole village for exposing his ankles. So, a third time, we have a hero that no Pharisee would want to identify with. When the son is found, the father throws the mother of all parties to celebrate the return. Why? Because he's happy. Now, those are the 3 stories, and I wish we had time to go over each of them in detail. And I'm going to get to that third one in next week in detail. But all I have time for right now is to just kind of summarize these 3 stories so that you can see why Jesus tells them. Now, these aren't in your notes, but you might want to write them down somewhere just to remind you of what this is about. 4 things I want you to note. Number 1, in each of these stories, the plot line involves something lost. A sheep is lost. A coin is lost. A son has wandered away from home. And you might want to, when you get home, go read that chapter again in your Bible and make note of all the usages of the word lost. Lose, loses, lost. So in each of the stories, the plot involves something lost. 2, in each of the stories, what's lost really matters to the hero of the story. I mean, isn't that true? The shepherd is so concerned about the loss of one sheep that he risks the safety of the other 99 to find it. The woman is so distraught over the loss of one coin, she cancels all of her plans, scours the house till she finds it. And the father is so brokenhearted that his son has been lost that he endures the scorn of the entire village by running to him when he finally heads for home. So in each case, what is lost matters so much to the one who lost it that it warranted an all-out search. And third, in each of the stories, there's a fully committed hero. And when what was lost is found, the hero is happy, and the hero throws a party to express his or her joy. All three of them stopped what they were doing, committed themselves to finding what was lost, and they all celebrated when they found it. And then one final thing. In each of the stories, the hero is someone who wouldn't really be admired by most religious leaders. The first hero is a shepherd, second-class citizen. The second is a woman, third-class citizen. The third is a father, a potentially admirable figure, but when they hear what he does as he raises his robes, no, they don't want any part of that. You put those four things together, and what do you have? You have Jesus standing in front of a group of long-standing religious types who think they know what matters to God. What matters to God, they think, is them. And that's all they think matters to God. Because when they see Jesus talking with the outcasts of society, they're angered because they believe that he, a rabbi, is diminishing God's name and dignity by associating with those kind of people. And Jesus is so angry by their thinking. He's so angered that he tells them not one, not two, but three stories, parables, back to back, as if to say, your perception of who matters to God and who doesn't is so far off that I'm going to clear this up once and for all. If you don't get the first story, maybe you'll get the second. If you don't get the second, maybe you'll get the third. Third time's a charm, I hope. But you're going to get this. And he tells them about lost things that matter to people they don't admire. So let me just give you two things to hang your hat on today. Two kinds of people I told you God's looking for. And here they are. Write these down. God, first, is looking for lost people. He's looking for lost people. Lost people matter to God so much that he's on an all-out search for them. Every time a lost person is found, he said, all of heaven rejoices with the hero of heaven, which is God. So God is looking intently for lost people. And then second, God is looking for fully committed people. God is looking for fully committed people. And the fully committed are not proud, self-conscious, religious types who think the most important thing in their life is their religious life. The fully committed are those who understand that God is looking for lost people, and the fully committed are the people who rejoice with God when someone is found. That's the fully committed. That's what God is searching for, an all-out search. Lost people and fully committed people. Now, why is God looking for fully committed people? Because only the fully committed people reach out to the lost. Only the fully committed people serve long hours at church to try to help create programs and things and be a place where the lost can be found. Only the fully committed pray diligently for their friends who will otherwise spend a Christless eternity. Only the fully committed stay up late, dreaming of ways to reach out to their lost friends and neighbors. Only the fully committed alter their spending habits so that they can give the full tithe and fund ministries to help find lost people. Only the fully committed look through eyes like God sees and think about others before they think of themselves. He's looking for lost people, and he's looking for fully committed people. So, that significance that we long for, it comes when what matters to God matters to us. And now you know what matters to God. Lost people, fully committed people. And that has to matter to us. You see, last week, I told you that God revealed to me that I had been a Pharisee, and I had to admit that it was true. And I finally discovered what matters to God. Lost people, fully committed people. And the hard part about this story for me was I thought I was fully committed. I wanted to be. I mean, I had invested 6 years of my life in school and seminary alone. I had committed myself to a life of ministry. The problem was that I thought serving him fully meant taking care of the already saved sheep. Not long after I read this chapter, I was in a grocery store line getting ready to check out for my groceries. Has any of you ever been to H-E-B on a Saturday? I don't know what it is about this place. And this was 15 years ago, and there weren't very many. I mean, this area hadn't even been developed yet. So the closest H-E-B to me was, I think, down on Rayford Sawdust Road. And man, I don't know if is it the free food samples or something that draws a crowd. I mean, as I stood there in line, I was about 5 deep in my line, and you know how you are when you're in line there at the grocery store. You have nothing to do. Once you've read the headlines of the National Enquirer and all the other magazines, you know you have anything to think about. And so I began to look around. I saw, my line, and there were about probably 8 to 10 other registers that had about 5 or more people in them. And then I looked behind and saw all the people still scouring and eating the free food samples and all that stuff. And I'm guessing that there were at least 50 people in line, not to mention whoever else was in the store. And I remember thinking, as I've just had read this chapter, I wonder how many of these people are lost and don't even know it. And how are they going to know they're lost if someone doesn't befriend them and be Jesus to them and help them understand that they're lost? And then my eyes started to leak. I was standing in line there and I'm going, I have totally missed it. And I don't know how I paid the cashier. I think I told her there was something in my eye or something like that. But from that moment on, I said that I wanted to be a part of helping lost people be found, because that matters to God. And not only that, I wanted to be part of a fully committed church that was committed to lost people. And those of you who were here 15 years ago, which isn't many of you, you heard me share this from my heart. And that's why this church exists, to find lost people and have fully committed people who are committed to finding lost people and rejoicing when they're found. And it's been my prayer that in this series, you would grab on to that same vision. Those of you who weren't here, those of you who were here may need to renew it and get back to the business of lost people, fully committed people. That's what matters to God. I told you at the beginning that God was looking for 2 categories of people. There are actually four categories of people. Those of you who are believers, there are 2 categories. You know what they are? 2 kinds of Christians: casual Christians and committed Christians. Which category are you in? And then there are 2 kinds of seekers. If you're here and you're lost, you've never established a relationship, there's 2 kinds of seekers. Those who are seeking and those who don't care to seek. And it's my prayer today that if you're here and you've never established that relationship with Jesus Christ, that you would at least start the search, that you would at least seek. Because God is looking for you.